Hi everyone, and welcome to your final English-specific lecture on COVID's futures. I don't know what day you're watching this. It might be November 3rd, November 4th, 5th, or whatever, but I know this week is a big one politically, and you might be feeling a lot of emotions. If you are in a bad place and feel like work this week is too overwhelming, I would beg you please reach out to one of your three professors, Dr. Rocco, Dr. Vobral, or myself. We will be happy to work with you, and we are serious about this. So before this lecture gets started, just some reminders. This lecture is in two parts with two separate videos. Please take a break between them, get a drink of water. Your next presentation assignment is due at the end of next week, November 13th. You won't have a joint lecture before this because the term is unbelievably winding down. Classes will end before Thanksgiving. So, since this is the last opportunity I will have by myself to talk to you, this lecture is basically my big pitch to you for why fiction matters, but it's also designed to help you with that final project that is going to be due at the end of term. That final project asks you to write a piece of future flash fiction, i.e. fiction that is less than 1,000 words long. So previously, I've talked to you about why it's important to pay attention to the language we use and the stories we tell, how these things can think for us, and how we have to be careful about how we consume them. But today I wanted to talk on a more upbeat note. In the same way that language and stories can shape our worlds for us, we can also use them deliberately to reshape the world around us. Fiction is the province of the imagination, and imagination is one of the most powerful tools we have for changing the world. Imagination lets us come up with different futures or alternate presents. And I know that sounds pretty corny, but it really is true. For proof, you don't have to look further than literally any given fascist regime. One of the first things they do on taking power is try to silence and jail artists, writers, etc. That's because art is immensely powerful in shaping public opinion and public action. So the upshot here, fiction helps us imagine the futures that we want and the ones that we don't want, the ones we want to avoid. It's reality's reflection, but it's also reality's sandbox. Fiction is where a culture test drives its own idea of itself and its ideas about where it wants to go next. So how does fiction do this? I'll give you a brief overview, then dive into the two examples you read for today, which both push against common pandemic tropes to help us see the pandemic differently. And I say the pandemic because the two short stories you read for today were actually written both in direct response to COVID, even though they're not about COVID itself, technically. So to begin, let's think about why fiction matters. So first off, just to review, what is fiction? Well, when I say fiction, I mean it in its broad sense as deliberately told, unreal stories. It can include novels and poetry, but also movies, TV, video games, comics, music, and some visual art. It's only a slightly smaller category in the wider category of art itself, and the key difference between fiction specifically and art more generally is that fiction always involves narrative of some type. In other words, a story, a sequence of events unfolding in time, as opposed to, say, some blobs of color on a canvas, which might be deeply beautiful and emotionally resonant, but don't give you a narrative. Fiction's relationship with reality is multiple and complicated. Its effects are multiple and complicated too. Fiction does at least three, and absolutely many more things, but I'm going to focus on these three effects of fiction in today's lecture. Number one, inspiration. Fiction helps us see a world that we want and how to take steps towards it. Number two, comfort. Fiction helps us live through a world that feels unbearable and unlivable. And number three, challenge. Fiction helps us see what's wrong with the world and what we could change about it. And you should now be able to answer question number one. As with all of my lectures, I forgot to mention this at the start, there is a lecture guide that goes along with this that also includes all of the links you see on today's presentation, as well as notes as to where you can duck into the quiz to answer the questions. So, what does all this stuff about fiction have to do with pandemics? Well, if you recall in the last English lecture, when I told you about some common pandemic tropes and genres, today I want to show you how fiction can challenge those genres by offering alternate possibilities. So to refresh your memory, With pandemics, you often get two types of stories, the kind of cure narrative and the apocalypse narrative. Of the two, the apocalypse narrative is the slightly more common one. It's the one we're more familiar with. These are genres with recognizable tropes, and remember, tropes aren't always necessarily bad. They can be used very well and very effectively. They definitely do the work I mentioned earlier of inspiration, comfort, and challenge, but they can be limiting too, because sometimes the worlds they offer are so extreme it's hard to make the leap from our world to theirs. Moreover, as I discussed in my last lecture, these leaps can be problematic, i.e. the zombie genre often teaches us that pandemics are times for competition, not cooperation, when a cooperative approach is definitely more likely to help stem the spread of a virus like COVID. Finally, and most importantly, with COVID, reality isn't likely to play out according to either apocalypse or cure narratives. We may not get a cure quickly, i.e. we may not get a vaccine quickly, and civilization probably isn't going to end because of COVID, i.e. we're not going to have an apocalypse. So the common cultural narratives we have are actually sometimes quite ill-equipped to help us think through this particular pandemic. So what do today's stories do better? So let me talk a little bit about them generally first. Accordingly, I set you two stories today that aren't stereotypical cure or apocalypse narratives. They're actively engaged in the work of reimagining the future in more complex ways than those usual genres. Both were written directly in response to COVID, though they are fictionalized, i.e. they're about a very similar but technically fictive viral outbreak. They're also a subgenre of science fiction that is called near-future science fiction, since they are set only a few decades from now and trying earnestly to imagine what the next decades will actually look like. And note in this lecture, if I ever say sci-fi or SF, what I mean is science fiction, the genre. So the two stories that you read for today have two very different flavors. One is definitely darker than the other, but neither of them can easily be called a utopian or a dystopian narrative. Why? Well, both stories imagine what we frequently don't see with pandemic stories, that the pandemic lingers and radically reshapes society. In particular, these are both stories that you could call slice of life. They're about regular people living in society, not heroic doctors or lone apocalypse survivors. I've also chosen both because they share a narrative conceit of grocery shopping, something very mundane, and also a focus, not a focus, usually in pandemic stories, which tend to go for the kind of exaggerated narrative. Like, you're not going to see someone grocery shopping in a zombie movie, probably. Both stories are also about the experiences of people of color. The slightly more optimistic of the two stories, is L.X. Beckett's Milk Run. Their story imagines a whole society reorganized around social distancing and its costs. And by the way, I say optimistic, but that's not the same thing as happy. The more pessimistic story is Tananarive Shopping Day. Her story imagines the same thing as Beckett's, only in a nation that has harshly cracked down on poor and marginalized communities for the purposes of quarantine. I'll talk about each story separately first, noting how it's using or subverting some of the pandemic genres and tropes that we talked about in my last lecture, and what it's doing to imagine the future. Then, at the end of the lecture, I'll talk about both stories together. Throughout, I'll include some pointers for the assignment that you have to write at the end of this class. And just FYI, you should now be able to answer quiz question number 2. So to start, let's talk about L.X. Beckett's Milk Run. So one important conceit of Beckett's story is that the pandemic safety measures we've lived with since May, i.e. social distancing, have been normalized. People have adapted to them and no longer find them restrictive. They've reorganized their lives around the idea that a deadly virus is still running around. These measures are a regular part of society now. People don't live in constant fear or anxiety of the virus, however, because all of the protective measures that we now see as extraordinary are normal to them. They're not symbols of something frightening. For example, in the story, the only time we see the narrator, Carmi, being afraid of the virus is near the end, when she sees a virus victim being taken out of a building on a stretcher. Some more concrete examples. So Carmi casually mentions that Leo, approaching her to ask a favor, is, quote, the closest anyone's been in a month to her. But she doesn't treat this as weird. It's just normal. Social distancing is just a part of this world. Second example, Carmi, quote, logs on to school. So schooling in this world is entirely virtual, and that is normal. So is exercise. Carmi has been exercising on a throw rug all winter and relishes the chance to go for a walk. Final example. In this story, people aren't quarantined forever, but asked to undergo periodic isolation to ensure that the virus doesn't spread. Again, folks treat this as normal, and they accept it. The only people who don't see it as normal are the terroristic-y Yellow Jackets. And this is a crucially important bit of imaginative work because it points out something that apocalyptic and cure pandemic stories often forget. People adapt, and they do it pretty readily. One consequence of our lack of adaptation stories is that we see people having honestly exaggerated responses to the impositions pandemic safety has taken on our lives, i.e. folks throwing tantrums about wearing masks when they are vital to prevent community spread, or throwing tantrums that they can't eat at restaurants when probably not a great idea. Some people seem to think that adapting their lives isn't possible, that a pandemic is, no matter what, an apocalypse, or something that will be cured so quickly that they can get immediately back to normal. But Beckett's story makes the point that people can and do adapt. And you should now be able to answer quiz question number 3. So the other key innovation of Beckett's story, and one that's quite different from especially the apocalypse pandemic genre, the one with zombies, is that they remain aware of how groups of people with conflicting interests are still major players in society, and how those groups have evolved with the pandemic. If you consider pandemic apocalypse stories, often you have a total breakdown of government, in which leftover groups of humans are pit against each other and fight each other. These groups frequently fall into stereotypes: the religious cult, the Mad Max-style hardcore survivalists, the hippie commune. Beckett's story does something very different. Since their story is near future, they imagine that the government still very much exists and society hasn't fallen apart. But some non-governmental groups have evolved to fit the pandemic. Moreover, their sense of how these groups will evolve is very believable. So I'll give you 2 examples here. The first example are the Yellow Jackets. In this story, the Yellow Jackets are a sort of semi-cult terrorist organization that's an evolution of anti-vaxxers. The Yellow Jackets purposefully expose themselves and others to viruses, often violently, because they think quarantining is stupid. This is a pretty realistic evolution of anti-vaxxer behavior. Anti-vaxxers purposefully expose their own children to viruses in the hopes of conveying immunity, and a combination of anti-vaxxers with the sorts of people who angrily refuse to wear masks and get pissed that others are wearing them is what constitutes the Yellow Jackets in the story. An interesting bonus side note, Beckett notes that the Yellow Jackets expose themselves to, quote, each new bug. This implies that this world has seen a series of outbreaks similar to COVID, which again is unfortunately a realistic scenario. So the second group that has evolved to fit the pandemic are a group of protesters. Beckett also imagines a group of Indigenous protesters staging an elaborate, tech-heavy protest on Lake Ontario. In doing so, they imagine innovations in protest strategy caused by the need to quarantine and isolate. So here, the protesters have created a spectacle that's impossible to ignore, but also socially distant. Like, it's outside of the city, it is on the water, and the way that they get people to notice it is using technology, cloud outfits, and cool lighting. The fact that the protesters are Indigenous also highlights the fact that Indigenous communities have been mostly passed over by the news during COVID, and this is true both of Canada, where Beckett is writing from, and of the US, despite these Indigenous communities experiencing some of the worst outbreaks. And these communities have been protesting the lack of federal resources directed to their communities, and have often kind of been summarily ignored. So here, Beckett is using fiction to represent reality even more accurately than the news media by including these protesters in their story. And you should now be able to answer quiz question number 4. And that is the end of the first part of this lecture. Take a break, get a drink of water, and then come back, and I will see you for part 2 of this lecture on COVID's futures.